and you can use certain formulas that exist for GDP. The guesswork comes in: how long will we be closed? How much of the economy will be closed? And geographically, what will be closed? So that's where the guesswork comes in. But what they are doing is taking certain assumptions, putting that into their model, and coming out with their forecasts.
Yeah. Steve, thanks. Steve Liesman there with the very latest on his rapid update. Tyler.
All right, Kel, let's get back to that big story of the day, which is oil and the crushing decline in that May contract, down more than 90% today alone as the May contract gets set to expire amid a lack of demand. West Texas crude hitting a penny, its lowest level ever. I'm looking down. It looks like now it is at 20 cents. Jeff Curry is the global head of commodities research with Goldman Sachs. Jeff, welcome. It is always great to have you with us. I'm going to take sort of baby steps here because I know that we have a lot of viewers who may not watch CNBC all the time regularly, but they're home now, they're tuning in, and they need an explainer here. How can this happen? How can oil go to 20 cents a barrel? Does it mean that oil has no value or that this futures contract has no buyers?
Well, let's start with the basics, is that WTI is what we call a landlocked crude. It prices 500 miles from any water. As a result, it depends upon pipelines to get the oil in, get the oil out. And you can think about what this demand shock has done. It has created a tsunami of oil that is moving through the global distribution system. To get an idea of how big this tsunami is you take oil demand before the start is running about 100 million barrels per day. It has now dropped down to somewhere around 75 million barrels per day. That's a 25 million barrel per day demand shock. Supply was up here, and as we all know, supply is sticky. It took time, and it's coming down now. But however, what you're left with is this surplus that's moving through the system. And when you think about landlocked crudes, they're joined by all these pipelines. And what happens, the pipelines, it's like driving down a freeway. You hit congestion, and then you come to a stop. That's where we are right now in landlocked pipeline crudes. Pipelines in places like pipeline crudes in places like Wyoming have already been trading at negative prices. Why? Because a producer needs to pay somebody to take that oil away. So when you think about this particular contract, what's happening right now is you cannot store the barrel of oil. And so when you think about the next contracts out, as you pointed out, they trade 27, December is at 33. So you're stuck with a situation where you can no longer arbitrage the spot price to those forward prices because you've filled up storage capacity, the pipelines are full, and you've hit containment issues. And what happens, that value of that oil today can't move, goes to zero.
So let me come back to you and point out that just as you were talking there, that May contract went negative. It is now negative by about more than $1 as I'm looking at it over there now, down at negative 140. What does that mean? Does that mean that producers would pay somebody to take the oil off their hands and store it for them? My backyard's available, Jeff.
You know, then the question is, you're going to use trucking or some other type of mechanism to dispose of that oil. So that oil has no economic value because it cannot be moved to a location where somebody could use it and refine it. So what's having to happen is you have to price it. And the reason why the producer would pay somebody to take that oil away is shutting down a well is extremely expensive. And sometimes you damage the well forever. So they will pay somebody to keep the well running. However, what we're likely to see coming out of this is massive shut-ins at the wellhead all over that West Texas and Gulf Coast region. So this is going to lead to lower oil supplies. However, we don't think this is the end of it. You're likely to see this continue to go on at least through the middle of May.
Yeah, I was going to ask you exactly what you just answered, and that is there no answer other than eventually a lot more production in West Texas, anywhere around the world, has to get shut in? And what's the consequence of that? It obviously, one is that less oil will be produced and maybe the price will stabilize one way or another. Number two is jobs are going to be lost.
Well, I think that the critical point here, and we emphasized this after the broadened OPEC plus production cut announcement, is that those are what you call voluntary cuts out of places like Saudi Arabia. What we're witnessing right now are necessary cuts forced on the market by economics. In this case, it's not even the price of oil, it's the inability to deliver it. It's logistical issues. And so, yes, you're likely to see substantial shut-ins occurring in North America, where we have a lot of pipeline crude. The other place would be places like Russia, where you have other pipeline crude, as well as Latin America and Canada. And so we expect to see necessary production cuts of substantial volumes, 3 to 5 million barrels per day in the U.S. alone. Because remember, demand is off somewhere around 20 plus million barrels per day. You're going to have to balance this market. Now, I want to be cautious here. Is that Brent, a waterborne crude, is trading at much higher levels.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted you to finish that thought there, because obviously the amount of production cuts is nowhere near the amount of demand decline that may be persistent for not just a matter of weeks, but potentially a matter of months and maybe even into next year. So when this contract expires and we roll to the next or the forward month, June, I think that's what it is, that contract itself is declining very precipitously today as well. What happens next, Jeff?
Well, I think again, thinking about when can this market rebalance, it is going to have to rebalance sometime in middle of May, because at that point we'll have exhausted global storage capacity. There'll be no place anywhere in the world to put another barrel of oil. And at that point, you have to see supply brought down in line with demand in a forced balance on the system. And if you think about the recovery trajectory of demand right now, last week was probably the peak demand loss. The reason why I would argue that is that you have seen Germany, Spain, and some of these other European economies begin to recover. Now, I want to be cautious here. The recovery will likely be slow, but the situation still presents a substantial surplus, but it is beginning to show some improvement. Now, let's think about this when we get towards June. Supply has been crushed. Demand begins to rise. You can actually start to see this market transition into a deficit by as soon as sometime like June. And I think that's really the key point here, is this market will be forced into a rebalancing.
So let me go for one of my double-headed questions for which I am famous, but it's pretty simple. What does this mean for the price of gasoline at the pump? What should I expect to pay 3 weeks from now, 2 weeks from now? Price at the pump. And second, what does it mean if I'm invested in oil stocks? Which ones are going to survive it? Which ones are just going to get crushed?
Well, let's start with the retail price of gasoline. Obviously, when you look at Brent, it's trading at $26 a barrel right now, because again, it's a waterborne crude that can move around. Ships can go in and out. I like to point out it prices 500 meters from the water. Now, when we think about what the value of oil is globally, it's going to be priced off of that waterborne crude at the margin, which means that your gasoline price is going to be supported by that much higher price that is associated with the Brent barrel. Now, in terms of thinking about the equities, as you've noted earlier, they haven't come off that much. And one of the key reasons is equities are what we call anticipatory assets. They anticipate the future. And so we look at the equities, they're pricing that turning point. What we're talking about is coming sometime, let's say late May, June. They can begin to look out into the future and see that recovery, which is why they have been immune to the sell-off for the most part. In contrast, commodities are what we call spot assets. They have to clear today's supply and demand. And as a result, WTI is dealing with a severe imbalance located in Cushing, Oklahoma.
Thank you for making sense of all this to the extent that sense can be made, Jeff Curry, and thank you for inviting us into your home today. We appreciate it. Kelly?
Just wild stuff. I'm so glad that we had Mr. Curry today. Brian Sullivan is standing by as well. Brian, with some more thoughts. We thought, after the action last hour, this was possible. Look at the price of WTI now. It's negative $7 a barrel. What does that literally tell you?
You know what it tells me is that my high school math teacher was wrong. Kelly and Tyler, all three of us went to high school in Virginia. I don't know about your teacher. Mine said you can't fall more than 100%. He was wrong. I mean, we're down 134% on the futures contract. So how can exactly this occur? We're down. The value of a price of a barrel of oil is now negative $6.50. Okay, so there's a lot of questions here, and Jeff laid it out far better than I could, but I'll try to make a slightly different take on this, which is when you look at a contract, a paper contract, that is for the price, ultimately, if you wish to enforce it, of a physical delivery of something. Jeff got into that a bit. So if you know you're sitting on the obligation to deliver a good, whether it's lean hogs or lumber or oil, whatever it is, and that's going to cost you something, it would make sense for you to sell it at a negative price rather than incur a greater price later. Also, keep this in mind. When you look at the price of any kind of a commodity, there is what they call an externality or a cost to closing it in. Again, Jeff laid this out, guys, at the beginning. But to reiterate, why would anybody sell oil at a negative price? Because it's expensive and sometimes environmentally difficult to actually shut down a well. Depends on the kind of well and where it is and whatever. Point is, it may be actually, bizarrely, more economic for a well owner to sell at a negative price, pay Kelly Evans to take my oil, rather than spend $50, $100, $150, a couple $100,000 to shut my operation down if I believe prices will rise. Does that make any sense? Because I've been up since 2:45.
Does anything about this make sense is the question, Brian. I mean, in other words,
This is history.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense because we can explain what's going on. But at the same time, we've been through a lot of different crises and economic events over the past several decades that have never resulted in this.
It's never. This is history in the making, okay? And I don't want to make light of it because there's going to be tens of thousands, if not more, job losses. They've already started. There's going to be many, many bankruptcies all across this. Obviously, we've got the PPP and the Small Business Loan Protection Program, and some of these Fed programs are designed to buy junk bonds, high yield. That is directly targeting, in many ways, the oil and gas industry. Don't forget, $240 billion in debt coming due over the next 5 years. Forget about negative prices, Kelly and Tyler. What's your ability as an oil company to pay your debt obligations when you're not only not making money on a product, theoretically, you may have to pay people to take it. Now, let's be clear. June, right now, is the price of oil. June. Not that May. The May contract's going to get the headlines. June is the price of oil. 22, whatever buck and change it is, 21.03. That's what we need to watch going forward. So oil still has a positive value. But you got to remember that June contract could roll over at any time as well. But think about all the debt. We've been talking about it for a long time. Oil is a four-letter word, D-E-B-T, and this is going to make those debt obligations much, much more difficult to repay, which could then have a trickle-down effect through the market. By the way, watch refiners, PBF and Par Pacific down 7%. They're crack spreads, they call it. Margins are going to get crushed. Stocks are getting hit as well. So there's a lot of angles here. But I think I speak for everybody when I say TGIF. See you next Monday.
Yeah, well, I think our next discussion might help explain why some of this has worsened lately across crude. Again, the WTI May contract is now at negative $8.61, negative $8.61. The June contract kind of hovering below $21 a barrel. It's down 16% right across the screen. We've got some breaking news out of Washington. It's not positive. Again, I wonder if that's feeding into some of this pressure. Kayla Tausche is here with the latest. Kayla?
Well, Kelly, there will not be a vote in the Senate today to expand the Paycheck Protection Program. This as a deal remains elusive between Democrats and the White House at this hour. House Democrats are expected to hold a conference call at 4 p.m. today to discuss the state of play. But opening a session on the floor today, Leader McConnell in the Senate said because there is no deal, there can be no Senate passage today. He is going to be calling another brief session of the Senate tomorrow at 4 p.m. where this package could possibly be brought up then. It would expand funding for small business loans as well as funding for hospitals and testing by close to $500 billion, but no vote in the Senate today. Kelly and Tyler, back to you.
You know, Kayla, what does that mean now for the timeline? I mean, over the weekend, the commentary was $310 billion. It's coming.